Hi, it's time for a chime video. So today we have a Rittenhouse Model 630 8-note long tube door chime base. Now the 630 is named the Williamsburg, and it originally came out around 1955, and it was in production until the early mid-70s. It's a clock chime, that's why it has this big wooden base. It's got these fancy scroll brackets here at the bottom. The customer didn't send the cover with the clock because the clock works fine, and there's no reason to risk the cover in shipping it just so everyone can take a look at it. However, I will try to find a picture of one and paste it into the video. So it's a relatively large base because it has large wooden back plate that everything is mounted to. These clips up at the top are where the connections for the clock are made. So you connect it and then sit the clock cover over the base. And the chime itself is actually relatively straightforward and simple, although it's got a few unique items. It's got a terminal strip here with a bunch of screws. This is where the wires get connected. Terminals 1 and 2 are for constant power from its low voltage transformer. This is a 24 volt chime rated at a minimum of 20 watts. I would recommend in today's world to use a 30 watt transformer, get a little more oomph, a little more available power. And then you have connections for front, rear, and side doors. These two connections here are jumpered together because they're not used anymore. There were several different variations of this chime because it was made for such a long period of time. This is most likely the second version or second series of the 630. The original ones, when they first came out, had what they called a chime sequencer, which was a different type of motor contact assembly that was used in lots of different chimes of that time. This is probably the second version, which we'll talk more about in a second. And then the third version used a more conventional one-piece Rittenhouse chime base that went across the bottom here. It did have a motor and solenoids and all that, but it was the same chime base that would have been used in a lot of what I call the 8600 series chimes that were more common in those days. So you have the terminal strip here, you have the motor and contact plate assembly here. You do have a rotary volume control, so you can adjust how hard the plungers strike the tube, so it does give you different volume in quotes. And then you have your 4 solenoids down here with the little neural adjustments that you can use when you hang the tubes to move them in and out closer or further away from the plungers. That's sort of how you fine tune. When you hang a chime like this and you hang tubes on it, there's a certain amount of setup that has to be done. You have to play with the volume and you have to play with how the tubes are hung in relationship to the front of the plungers to get the sound just the way you want. And just because this one may have been turned out 12 turns doesn't mean that every other tube will be exactly the same. You kind of have to play with it and fine tune it so it sounds exactly the way that you want it to sound in your house, because they are different. It's sort of like a musical instrument. They are basically the same, but there are variations in the whole thing. So the motor assembly is sort of the heart of the chime. What you have here is a metal bracket, and underneath the bracket you have a sealed synchronous motor. And this is a very high quality motor for its day. And then the output shaft of the motor connects to the rotor, which is this point here. And then on the ends of the rotor, there are 2 contacts here and a single contact here. The single contact, the contact here on the short end, rubs up against this round circular copper plate that's in the middle of the contact plate, and there is a slot in it. The slot is the start-stop point for the chime motor. So right now it's sitting in the starting position. When someone comes up and presses the button on the front porch, it causes the motor to begin to turn, and as it turns off the starting point, this contact touches the copper disc, which is where the motor picks power up so it can run all the way through the cycle without stopping. When it reaches the stopping point, which is the other side of the gap, it breaks the connection and the motor stops. So it's a fairly simple design. This is how most more modern type chimes operated in some form or another all the way until you get into the mid 80s. For Rittenhouse, it was more like the late 70s because that's when they started to change over to electronic chimes. On this end of the contact rotor, there are two contact points here. One of them touches this curved copper wire that's embedded into the base of the contact plate. The base of the contact plate is made out of some kind of phenolic resin or plastic. Then there are the 8 contact points, 4 here and 4 here, and these are the ones that are wired to the solenoids to create the correct sequence of notes when the chime rings. Basically what's happening here is these two contacts are joined together on the end of the rotor. So it's one piece of metal essentially, and as it rotates, it makes a connection between the embedded copper wire and the contact point, which makes that particular solenoid ring. If you were to take a little jumper wire and touch one end of the jumper wire to the copper wire and the other end to one of the contact points, that solenoid will energize. So it's a relatively simple design. Motor turns the rotor, rotor makes the connection makes the solenoids strike in the right order, and you have a door chime. It's pretty simple. This one has been worked on at some time in the past by someone. I got clues on that when the owner of the chime sent me pictures before he sent it in, because these two screws are slotted screws. These two screws are Phillips screws, and they didn't use Phillips screws on chimes in the 60s. And also the contact plate here has standoffs. It stands off the front of the metal bracket. This side, the standoffs are little brass tubes. And on this side, someone has put in larger, like nylon thick washers, which is fine. It all works okay. So we just left it as it is because why horse around with it if it works okay? It's been worked on before. The problem with this particular chime was simply that the customer described it as you would activate the chime by pushing the button. It would ring 2 or 3 notes and then it would stall and stop, and you'd have to sort of bump the rotor to get it going again. And it was basically old, tired, and somewhat dirty. The contact points and the embedded copper wire were very dirty. The contacts on the end of the rotors were very dirty, and one of them, this one down here, these are made out of pieces of bent copper strap, and the end of it had actually worn away, and it wore away. It's the contact that runs across the little contact points. It had worn away just from rubbing against the contact points because copper is relatively soft, and it just wore out. So it would break the connection, then it wouldn't work correctly, and if you nudge it, that made it go again. It jiggled it around, made a connection, and then it would take off again. So there was all of that. The other thing which I thought was interesting was there has to be a certain amount of alignment between this outer bent contact and this inner one, because they have to touch, the outer one has to touch the embedded copper wire, and the inner one has to touch the contact points, and it has to do it reliably, because if it misses, then that note doesn't ring. What I found interesting was it seemed to me that when this little assembly with the contacts was riveted to the rotor here, it was somewhat misaligned. You would think that it would be riveted on and it would be at a 90-degree angle to the rotor itself and straight and line up correctly and all that sort of stuff. And it wasn't. It was kind of like, instead of being straight, it was kind of tweaked a little bit. And because of that, the outer connection, this contact, it just was barely touching the edge of the embedded copper wire, not making a really good connection, and that's not really right. So the worn end of the contact, the inner contact, was repaired, and then the whole assembly was tweaked a little bit to make it line up better, and that works great. There isn't that much more about it. It just had a lot of wear and tear. The solenoids, let's look at the solenoids real quick. The solenoids here, this is a whole assembly. These are 4 solenoids, all built into an encased enclosure that's held onto the base with a screw here and a screw here. And then this upper bracket with the adjustable threaded hangers for the tubes. This is another assembly that's bolted to the base with screws and nuts. This type of assembly, this is like an assembled piece. It's a box, a metal box with the 4 solenoids, which contains the springs and plungers. And then down in here where you really can't see, it's all wired to like a little terminal strip, and that's where all of these wires are connected. So it was one assembly. It probably made manufacturing easier because somebody could sit there and assemble these, and there were boxes and boxes of them, and then it would get bolted in and wires would get soldered on, and it was just fast and easy. I've seen this in another chime that I repaired recently, same type of assembly. You'll see a video about that coming up. It was probably just a good way to manufacture it. Very easy and also very sturdy. This is a very sturdy box. It has a little bit of compliance to it because it's mounted on sort of rubber washers on this side and this side, which is good. And all in all, it's a nice chime and it works really well. So I'm going to go ahead and set it up on the wall, put some tubes on it, and let's ring it and see what it sounds like. All right, so after all that, let's see how well our handiwork has turned out. I have it set up here. It's got 4 tubes, which I'll show you in a second, and a single push button. What should happen is when I push the button, the motor should activate, the rotor will rotate, making the connections and ring the chime. Very simple. Just like that. Now, you might have heard that one of the notes sounds a little clunky. That's because the tubes that are on it are not the original Rittenhouse tubes. There are a set of tubes that I own that I use here in the shop, and the 4th tube has a crack in it. And that's what happens sometimes. No way to really fix it, and it sounds a little clunky, but that's what gives the chime character. Now you can see the 4 brass tubes here, and they just hang on the hangers. These do have little adjustment nuts so you can move them in and out and kind of fine tune how it sounds. There's also a volume control here, which regulates how hard the plungers strike the tubes. Just like that. I hope you found this interesting, and perhaps for someone it will be helpful. If it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube because that helps us just a little bit. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications, and every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.